Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Bradford's fall lecture and a series of public lectures we're giving ahead of the May 8th election in our attempt to engage Bradford in some of the key issues in the election beyond what the politicians are trying to inform us about. So we hope that this will provide us with another opportunity to engage in some of the issues around the election for Bradford. I'd like to introduce to you Kate Karban, a colleague of mine, who is going to talk about the impact of austerity in Bradford. Kate's been working with the council on a huge audit of poverty issues in Bradford, and she's going to draw on that work with the council in her lecture today. She's going to talk about the impact of the government's austerity programme on Bradford, on poverty in Bradford, with reference to the wider issues, particular around Kate's research interests around health inequalities and mental health well-being. So over to Kate. Thank you. She's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some questions.
I'll tell you we'll talk more than an hour. I'll probably be able to tell if I'm going over that. Not only will Donna look a little concerned, but I expect you'll be starting to nod off. So it's great to see people in the audience, some of you familiar faces, but equally it's good to see people that perhaps I haven't met yet. As Donna said, I've been involved in work around health inequalities, particularly from a social work perspective. I'm based in the Division of Social Work in the Faculty of Social Sciences, and I am very much coming at the whole topic of austerity and poverty from a social work perspective, but drawing on a range of different information and concepts to inform that. I've been involved in work around the Social Work and Health Inequalities Network, which is an international social work network looking at health inequalities. And as Donna said, I'm currently involved in working with the Bradford Council's Poverty Scrutiny Committee. Sorry, Quentin. Keep having a little drink. Austerity and poverty are very complex issues, and I'm not going to pretend to provide all the answers. I may end up raising some questions, but please don't sit there hoping that you're going to have some answers to some very complex problems about poverty. And inevitably, by focusing on some aspects of austerity and poverty, I will ignore some things or leave some things out in terms of the space that we have. But I hope I can do justice to some of the issues that I want to talk about this afternoon. I think before we start, it's worth just considering, well, first of all, just thinking about Bradford. And one of my concerns about this lecture is that I end up focusing on lots of things that are difficult in Bradford, some of the challenges that Bradford faces. And I've put this picture up here of the City Park, because I think Bradford's got lots going for it, and that to me represents one of the positive things about Bradford. There's lots more positive things about Bradford, but I don't want people to think that I'm trying to paint a very negative picture of Bradford. What I want to be looking at is some of the issues around austerity and poverty that present pretty substantial challenges to people of Bradford and Bradford communities. I think I also want to just comment on this notion of austerity. The dictionary definition of austerity really refers to something that's plain and simple. No luxury, no comfort. And I think we can see that running through the ways in which austerity has been used as part of a regime to reduce public spending, particularly in terms of welfare cuts to local government and so on. I'm not going to talk about the NHS tonight. I think that's an equally important but different area of focus. But austerity, I think, has been seen currently very much as a way of reducing the public spending deficit, but also, and I think this is fairly openly acknowledged by everyone, as a way of reducing the power of the state, and not just responding to the deficit, but from an ideological position of reducing state expenditure on public services. I think it's also important, given that I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health and well-being, that I refer to issues around a definition of mental well-being as a positive state of mind and body, feeling able to cope with a sense of connection with people, communities and the wider environment. And that's a definition from the Department of Health, one of the Department of Health documents. And the reason I've chosen that definition is that I want us to be focusing in a very inclusive way on mental health and well-being, as something which can affect all of us, any one of us, at different times in our lives. And so, in my mind, when I'm talking about mental health and well-being, this also encompasses people who have experiences of more severe and enduring mental health problems. But the notion of mental health and well-being, in its broadest sense, is something that affects any one of us on a day-to-day basis, particularly if we're under stress or facing adversity. I think it's also important in the context of Bradford just to again mention issues around diversity. Although I'm focusing on poverty, austerity and mental well-being, it's important to recognise that all of those experiences are also affected by issues of gender, age, ethnicity, sexuality, and probably a number of other factors as well. And that those experiences actually intersect and compound one another, so that we cannot separate them all out and say, well, this is poverty and this is about gender. We have to recognise that they're intertwined. It's particularly important when we think about the diverse ethnic communities that make up the rich diversity in Bradford. And for example, there is evidence that women in ethnic minorities tend to experience poverty to a greater extent than women who are not from those ethnic minorities. And in particular, women from Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities may experience poverty more. So again, already we can see that this will have an impact in Bradford. Additionally, Bradford's a very youthful city. Don't know if I'm talking about the audience here or myself, but the age structure of the population is that we have more young people, if you like, than other cities. In fact, we're the second youngest city in England, with London being the first. Now again, if we're talking about unemployment, and unemployment rates being higher for young people, you can see that that will have a disproportionate effect on Bradford and the population of Bradford. So it's important going through this talk that we bear in mind the complexities, if you like, when we talk about people experiencing poverty. Now, just very quickly, this is just to give you a little map of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to provide a sort of brief overview of poverty in relation to welfare reform, the development of the welfare state, and that's a big topic in itself, but just a kind of quick overview of the welfare state. Look at some of the evidence and data that we have about poverty in Bradford, and then I want to move on really to critique this notion of poverty and the problem of poverty. What do we mean by it? And what are some of the pitfalls that may occur when we talk about poverty? And I'm then going to go on and refer to what I've called the double whammy, although I suspect if we unravel it further, we may think it's actually a triple whammy or more, in terms of the way in which poverty and mental health and well-being interact. And finally, I'll offer some thoughts around inequality and social justice, being the true social worker that I have been. So, here we have an image which is focusing on the development of the welfare state. And this figure on the left-hand side is Beveridge, who's setting out to slay the 5 giants: want, ignorance, disease, squalor and idleness. And this is about the beginning of the welfare state after the Second World War. Now, let's just go a little bit further back than that and think about what we had prior to the welfare state. We had the role of churches, very often through other charitable groups, in providing support to people who were seen to be poor and needy. We also had the poor laws. We often think the poor laws are a very long time ago. When I started out in social work, which perhaps is further ago than I care to remember, I was working as a very young social worker, I should say. I was working with people who had actually worked under the poor law regime before the National Assistance Act came in 1948. So, in my history, it's not that long ago. But what we saw with the poor law and with the way in which charitable organisations worked was a very clear distinction between people who were deserving and those who were not deserving. That was particularly exemplified with, for example, the Charity Organisation Society, and many people say this is part of the origins of social work as well, that the origins of social work lie within the Charity Organisation Society. But I suspect many of us would feel uneasy with the strong moral tone that came from that organisation in terms of helping people who were deserving. The strong sense of individual responsibility and people taking responsibility for choices which might or might not leave them in poverty. So the Poor Law, as I've said, was only abolished in 1948 with the National Assistance Act. And the notion of the welfare state was very much based on protecting the majority of the population. It wasn't something for just those people over there who might be having difficulties. It was for everyone. And it was designed to protect people, whatever their needs might be at any point in their life. And the expression from the cradle to the grave is one that was frequently used around the welfare state. And I think for many people that's something that we want to hang on to and what we want to protect. Now, there was a sense, after the establishment of everything that went with the welfare state, that things were getting better, things were good. We'd moved beyond those awful times with people in poverty. And Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister in 1957, said in a speech, actually he's often quoted as saying, "We've never had it so good." In fact, what he said was most of our people have never had it so good, which might suggest there's a clue that poverty hadn't entirely disappeared. And some of you, again, perhaps people of a similar age to myself, may remember this particular image, which is from the film that was made in the 1960s called Cathy Come Home. And this was an extremely powerful film looking at the impact of homelessness on one particular family. And this was associated with the idea that we were rediscovering poverty. Oh, it hasn't gone away. We still have people who are living in poverty in this country, despite the welfare state and all the progress that's been made. This was backed up as well by work that was carried out in the 1970s. Peter Townsend worked on poverty in the UK, his particular publication in 1979. And we also had the Black Report, which was commissioned by the Labour government in 1977 to look at health inequalities. And that report from the Black Commission raised very important questions a number of years after the inauguration of the welfare state and the creation of the National Health Service about the relationship between people's occupational class or their socio-economic status and mortality, what we might now call the social determinants of health. And this raised important questions still about responsibility and choice, material deprivation, and it still echoed notions of deserving and less deserving poor. Although the plight of this report was actually quite difficult because by the time it was published in 1980, the Conservative government of the time didn't really want to know about it and it was effectively swept under the carpet. But poverty hadn't gone away. Just want to say a little bit more now about definitions of poverty. The definition that's often used by government is around absolute poverty. This is based on the minimum income that households may be receiving. And based on if people are receiving less than 60% of the median income, which is roughly just under £16,000 at the moment. So if households rather, are living with less money than that, they are seen to be in poverty. Now, this may be quite useful in some ways because it provides a baseline. It provides a way of measuring whether or not levels of poverty are going up or down. But there are some problems with an absolute measure of poverty. And one of them is that income is related to households. And again, it doesn't determine how income is allocated within households, which may have particular implications for women and their access to resources within households. And secondly, it fails to take account of housing costs, which may vary quite significantly. And if we look at Bradford, for example, rents in social housing, I mean, social housing has kind of hit the headlines a bit this week in terms of the election manifestos, but average rents in social housing in Bradford are £355 per month, compared to the average private rent, which is £513. So already we could see if people are working on the poverty line, that will make a significant difference to people's income. And before I move on to just talk a little bit about ideas about relative poverty, it's again perhaps worthwhile to acknowledge that there are people living in absolute poverty who have very few resources, who are almost living in destitution. And again, perhaps it's worth mentioning here the situation facing asylum seekers and refugees, particularly asylum seekers who have not been given leave to remain and have no recourse to public funds. But additionally, the impact of job centre sanctions may leave people in destitution as well. say a bit more about that later on. But the other definition that I'm offering here is from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in relation to relative poverty. And this is seen to be when a person's resources, or mainly their material resources, but also other resources, are not sufficient to meet the minimum needs, including social participation. So it's not just about your income or how much money you've got, but can you afford to do the things that we assume and take for granted are the things that make life worthwhile. Now, we mayn't necessarily all agree on that, but there is a notion about some things which we would probably see to be pretty fundamental to being able to participate in civic life. So relative poverty, which was a term initially introduced by Peter Townsend, is based on standards and expectations, and these may change not just in relation to income, but also in relation to wider social factors. I suppose 30 years ago, we wouldn't have thought a mobile phone was necessary for our well-being. 30 years ago? 20 years ago? But most people now would say a mobile phone was essential. I'm not saying everybody has one, but it probably would be seen to be essential. But also things like, can you afford a spare pair of shoes for your children? What if your child wants to go to a birthday party with a school friend? Can they go because they can take a small present with them? Or are you saying to them, I'm sorry, you can't go because we can't afford for you to take anything? So this may not mean that people are in absolute poverty, but in terms of their participation, their social relationships, the notion of relative poverty may be very significant. And notions of relative poverty now, initially when Townsend did his work around relative poverty, he and his colleagues decided what people needed and what they didn't need in order to look at this definition. But some of the surveys that have been done since that time, over a number of years, repeated over a number of years, sort of under the title of Breadline Britain, have used focus groups of people representative of the range of diversity in the population to work out how to agree on the things that people do need and the things that people are perhaps see as less important in terms of being able to interact in society, to have a social life, be able to visit people, to use public transport, perhaps for the occasional day out or to visit family. All of those things fit into that. So, having made that distinction between relative and absolute poverty, I just want to say a little bit about welfare reform, because that's been a very important element of this notion of austerity. And some people might say this has been going on for many years, and there's certainly been a lot of discussion about the growing financial consequences of benefits and welfare spending, as well as the NHS. A lot of the discussions that goes on about caring for older people as well falls into that. What can we afford? Can we afford to provide decent quality care for everyone? Amongst other changes, though, we've seen the employment and support allowance introduced as a replacement for incapacity benefit. So for those people who find it difficult to obtain and maintain work due to their health, in the past would have received incapacity benefit, but since this was introduced in 2008, they will now be applying for employment and support allowance. This was actually introduced initially by the previous Labour government. So again, it's not just about saying, well, it's all one political party that have created some of these issues. Now, associated with the employment and support allowance was this notion of the work capability assessment, so that people who had any health issues that might be seen to prevent them getting work would have to be assessed to see if they really were fit for work, or if they were deserving, if you like, of support. People's experiences of those work capability assessments have been pretty grim. They have been carried out by private healthcare organisations, and the role of ATOS in this has been notorious. They're no longer doing it, I understand, but the problem continues. And many people are successful in appealing against the decisions that are made when they're saying, yes, of course you're able to work, even if somebody is clearly struggling. But there's still a cost, there's still a personal cost for people who have to go through that appeal process. There's still a cost in terms of perhaps the weeks of not knowing whether they're going to receive the allowances that they feel that they're eligible for. So that's the employment and support allowance. The current government has also introduced universal credit as a way of streamlining a range of benefits that we might already be familiar with. Housing benefit, income support, the employment and support allowance that I mentioned, job seekers allowance, and the working tax and child tax credits. Now, In many ways, the idea of streamlining all those benefits and having a flexible system which is responsive to people's changing circumstances, maybe in and out of work, different amount of hours per week being worked, could be seen to be helpful. However, there have been enormous problems in rolling that out. It hasn't yet arrived in Bradford, and again, I understand that September this year is when universal credit is going to be introduced to Bradford, initially for single people. But there have been problems with it. And there are also a number of concerns about how the money is going to be not allocated, that's the word I'm looking for. People will have monthly payments, so that will perhaps create problems in budgeting for people on a small income who have weekly payments to make. We also have seen changes to housing benefit and the bedroom tax. I suspect everybody here is familiar with the publicity that surrounded the bedroom tax, whereby people in receipt of housing benefit who are seen to have a spare bedroom have had their benefits reduced, or have been told that they need to find alternative accommodation. And again, this has caused considerable hardship for people. There is also an overall benefit cap, which has currently been set at £26,000, so no one household can have benefits of more than £26,000, and there is talk now of reducing that to £23,000. This has been challenged in the Supreme Court, and the judges ruled that it wasn't unlawful. However, they did say that it probably contravened the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child because of the impact on child poverty in those households where anything above the benefit cap was not going to be available, and there were very high housing costs, particularly in certain, you can imagine perhaps in London where housing costs would be very high. So there are concerns about the overall benefit cap and also below inflation uprating. So these are just some aspects, which I've gone through quite quickly, about what we would call welfare reform. So one of my concerns about this talk, there were so many numbers. It's quite difficult to try and to make sense of something without using numbers, but equally, in the end, if you're anything like me, you get a bit kind of overwhelmed by all these different facts and figures. But just let's think a little bit about the situation in Bradford. By the government's own statistics, Bradford is the 26th most deprived district in England. So out of 326 districts, and Bradford comes pretty well, high or low, depending on how you look at it, in terms of levels of deprivation in the area. Bradford's also second in relation to Yorkshire and the Humber, so the second most deprived district, and the first one, in fact, is Hull. 31% of the residents in Bradford live in 94 neighbourhoods that are in the most deprived 10% of England. So there are clearly a number of issues about inequalities affecting Bradford. But as we'll go on to see, those aren't just about affecting Bradford overall, but then there are inequalities within Bradford as well. So Bradford as a district has greater levels of income inequality than many other parts of the country. And there is a large gap between those people who have higher incomes and those who have the lowest incomes. So we have to think a little bit about, do we need to be thinking about addressing issues about income inequality, not just raising incomes? And many people in Bradford have a standard of living which seem to be well below that which most people would consider to be acceptable in Britain today. And so wards with the highest proportion on households on an annual income of less than 15,000 include Little Horton, Manningham and the City District. We also in Bradford have high levels of child poverty. As of 2010, more than 1 in 4 children, that's over 36,000 children, in the district live in poverty, compared to a figure of 1 in 5 nationally. But in some areas in Bradford, that rises to half of the children. In some neighbourhoods, 1 in 2 children are living in poverty. Personally, I think it's a kind of massive indictment of the society that we live in. Not blaming Bradford for that, but it says a lot, I think, that so many people and so many children are living in poverty in Bradford. If we think about unemployment rates, the district unemployment rate is 11.2%, and this compares poorly with the figures for the Yorkshire and Humber region and also for England overall, as you can see from the figures on the slide here. But if we look at other communities, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have estimated that the figure for Pakistani communities in Bradford, in fact, is 15.49%. So the unemployment rate is higher for some communities in Bradford. So again, we can't just look at one blanket figure, we have to look at the inequalities within the area. Moving on, excuse me, and thinking a little bit about health inequalities, it's worth recognising, I mean, first of all, that Bradford is seen to have a low wage and low skills economy, and that Bradford really suffered as a result of the decline in the manufacturing and specifically the textile industries. There are also high levels of fuel poverty and poor housing stock, and of course those two things go together. Fuel poverty is not just about paying the bills, which is often a challenge for people, but in fact if you live in poor housing where there's poor insulation and poor heating systems, then that will actually increase the amount that you will have to pay on fuel. There is also evidence about high levels of health inequalities in Bradford, and just two indicators of this I'm just going to sort of pick out, and one of those relates to infant mortality and the other to life expectancy. Bradford has the second highest rate of infant mortality in England and Wales, at rates which are almost double the average for England and Wales. So the national rate for England and Wales is 4.2 babies per 1,000 live births who do not live. Whereas the rate in Bradford is 7.9 per 1,000. And in the most deprived areas in Bradford, that figure increases to 9.9. I think this is truly shocking. I'm sure I'm not the only one who is in many ways shocked by these figures. But again, it reveals the inequalities within Bradford as well as the ways in which Bradford is disadvantaged compared to other areas. And I'm not suggesting people aren't working really hard on these things already. There are very clear strategies in place in terms of public health, figures in Bradford, and in terms of the Health and Wellbeing Board. So I'm not suggesting people are turned away from this. They are working to address those figures. So it's not a criticism of people who are wanting to make a difference. We can also look at life expectancy for Bradford. We see that life expectancy for both men and women is lower in Bradford than it is for the region. Again, we're talking about Yorkshire and Humber, but also for England overall. So life expectancy for men is 77.5 years, whereas in England overall it's 79.2. And there's a similar discrepancy for the life expectancy for women in terms of Bradford, the region, and the country overall. Again, it's worth recognising that people who live in Wharfdale, northern part of Bradford, may actually live 5 years longer than people who live in the south area, in areas such as Tom. So again, we see the inequalities within Bradford. And there's been a report recently called Due North about the north-south divide. And looking at health inequalities in terms of the north and the south, there is evidence that a baby girl who's born in Manchester is likely to live 15 years less in good health than if she had been born in Richmond, Surrey. Again, it's a massive difference. And again, we'll come back to this issue of the north-south divide. I've put the figure up here about with higher rates in Bradford of people claiming what was incapacity benefit and now employment and support allowance on the grounds of mental health. Figures that I have, which go back to 2011, suggest that this rate of people claiming those benefits is 3.5% of the working age population, compared to 1.7% nationally. So again, we can see the impact of inequality in Bradford and perhaps the relationship in many respects with mental health and well-being. Keep an eye on the time. It's overwhelming people with figures. So if you like, I hopefully have set out some of what you might call the hard facts about poverty in Bradford. But let's think a little bit about what that experience might mean on the ground, what the real lived experience might be. And I'm just going to draw on a piece of work that was commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on the experience of poverty associated with unemployment in the recession in Bradford between 2008 and 2011. And this is a piece of work I was involved with colleagues that I used to work with. I still call it Leeds Met, and it's now Leeds Beckett. But this was a piece of work looking at the experiences of unemployment in Bradford. Now, I'm not suggesting here that unemployment is the only way or the only cause of poverty. We also know that, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimate that nearly half of poverty that we see is actually related to people who are in work for a whole number of reasons. So I'm not suggesting that this is just about unemployment, but because we have this data from this particular study, which involved focus groups with people who are in transition in the workforce, they were out of work at the time, both groups who were between the ages of 18 and 25, and then also people between the ages of 50 and 65. And just on the left-hand side here, these were the main themes that we drew out of the data from those focus groups about people experiencing financial strain, difficulty in finding work, loss of a time structure to the day. What's the point in getting up if you've got nothing to do? Loss of a social role, anger and frustration about their situation, and stigma related to the status of being unemployed. And the quotes on the side are just a sort of very small selection, really, but really on this slide relate to the material effects of being unemployed. Not having enough money, worrying about not having enough money, how are we going to make ends meet? But also the stress that that may put on family life and relationships. People saying that their marriages and their relationships were really under a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of tension in the households because of their difficulties in not having enough money to make ends meet. And one person said, you're existing, you're not living, you're just kind of getting by. But I think this idea about the non-material, if you like, effects of unemployment and poverty can also be seen on some of the quotes here on this next slide. People talking about being really depressed so that they find it hard to get out of bed in the morning. The sense of loss of dignity if you're unemployed. You feel worthless. And everybody sees people on the dole as dole-dossers. If you don't have a job, you are lower than everybody. And when you're unemployed, you become a second-class citizen. So these are some of the other consequences that people found as a result of being unemployed. It wasn't just the day-to-day difficulties of making ends meet, but it was also the impact on their sense of well-being, their sense of self-esteem, of who they were. And if we think back to that definition that I offered at the beginning about mental well-being, which talked about a positive state of mind and body, feeling safe and able to cope, a sense of connection with people, communities and the wider environment, we can see that there's quite a gap, I think, between these experiences as expressed in this study and this notion of mental health and well-being. Furthermore, people also found it was very difficult for them to face up going to get help if they felt their depression was at such a level that they needed to see the doctor. They didn't want to be labelled, they didn't want to be classified, as they felt this would create even more stigma for them. If they, not only were they unemployed, but they were then going to have a sort of mental health label, which would create further stigma for them. So we can see from here a clear sense of exclusion, a very individualised experience that impacted on the people's sense of self and well-being. Now, people often had some very good coping strategies as well, which I haven't pulled out here. Ways of managing this distress that they were experiencing. So I don't want to entirely paint people as victims of this. People were able to find ways of managing, even if they'd had no control of the circumstances that got them into this situation. And many people had kind of good strategies around, based on relationships, based on having a routine, that actually helped them get by. So I'm not, again, not suggesting that everybody just kind of went under, but there was a strong sense around this loss of self-esteem and sense of self-worth. So where does this come from? You should sort of say, well, unemployment is an unfortunate experience, but why should we think any less of people if that happens to them? So let's just think a little bit about this problem of poverty. I think I would suggest that one of the problems with spotlighting poor people and spotlighting poverty is that we end up focusing on the behaviour of poor people. And there's a slippage between the problem of poverty to the problem of poor people and what they're doing or not doing to be in that state. And I think we can see that played out in a number of different ways. If you like, the discourse around poverty, I think, is incredibly powerful. There's also a risk, and Ruth Lister in her book on poverty, she obviously did an awful lot of, Ruth Lister was here, wasn't she? A number of years ago. So there's a good history of dealing with issues around poverty at the university. But Ruth Lister says, we have a responsibility to be very careful about how we address issues of poverty, and I'm very kind of mindful of that this evening as well, that we don't end up reinscribing and reinforcing these ideas about poverty by focusing on people who are experiencing poverty. But that we can only justify doing this if we think we can enable ourselves to examine the attitudes and behaviours that exist around us, and perhaps to think about how we might change those. The Centre for Social Justice is an organisation that's set up by Ian Duncan Smith, who's been the Work and Pensions Secretary in the coalition government. I think the work that articulates a particular approach towards poverty that I would wish to challenge. It refers to the literature around the Centre for Social Justice, refers to 5 pathways to poverty, including family breakdown, educational failure, economic dependency and worklessness. And there's a incredibly powerful quote, which is something along the lines of, for far too long, worklessness and dependency have been passed from generation to generation like a family business in some of our poor communities. I would suggest that actually some of these things are an outcome of poverty, not the causes of poverty. And they play into what we could call othering, a way in which we might talk about other groups of people, and we draw a line. It's them and us way of talking, which draws a line between people who are poor and people who aren't poor, and effectively stigmatises those people who are in poverty. And it feeds ideas of disrespect and stigma. So I think we need to be very careful about the discourse around poverty, which constructs poor people as a burden, as a threat, and all of the other stereotypes that we can see. And also, we need to challenge this notion around the culture of poverty and the intergenerational transmission of poverty associated with worklessness. Because of the work that's been done, there is virtually no evidence for that. It's a kind of media myth almost. Very powerful one, but there is virtually no evidence for the fact that poverty is transmitted intergenerationally through worklessness. It's more imagined than real. And also, of course, it points to this notion of worklessness. And we know that many people who are in work are also in poverty due to low wages, due to being in part-time work. There's been a massive increase in part-time work. Self-employment, which of course may have many benefits, but also may add to people's insecurity. And again, there's been a lot of publicity about 0 hours contracts and the impact they have on people's lives. So, thinking about poverty in the way that we often see it in the press and in political discourse effectively demonises the poor. And when I first started thinking about this talk, I originally thought I would look at election manifestos. They've only just come out this week, so it's been a bit tricky. But I think it's interesting to look at some of the political discourse, and these are some of the expressions that we see in some of the political parties' literature prior to the election manifestos coming. It's about people who work hard and play by the rules, making work pay, standing up for hard-working people, making sure people who work hard and do the right thing, what's the right thing? Get on in life, and tackling the something-for-nothing culture. And I think this discourse is very powerful, and when I talk about discourse, I'm really meaning the way the language that we use shapes how we understand things. That language itself is not neutral. And this emphasis on people working hard really is effectively a way of putting down those people who are not able to work, for whatever reason. Perhaps because they can't get a job, or because their health or disability prevents them from doing so. And the tackling something-for-nothing culture, again, echoes, in my mind, ideas about skivers, benefit scroungers and cheats and so on. And of course we see this amplified and played out in the media. People who know me will hopefully be reassured that I didn't go out and buy all these newspapers. This is a figure that I've borrowed from a book called Bloodline written by Lansley and Mack. But these images, I think, around the headlines, around benefits, granges and cheats and so on, have been very prevalent, and they both reflect and are reflective of the political discourse. I don't know about anybody else, there's a bus, at least one bus that goes around Bradford, you've probably seen it. It says, do you know a benefit cheat? Yes. And actually I've been meaning to get, I keep thinking I must leave this bus and take a photograph. Because what does this do? It drives people against each other. It means we're going around saying, oh, I wonder if they're cheating. Oh, what's going on over there? It creates a climate of suspicion of other people who may not be doing the right thing. And actually the figures around benefit fraud are remarkably low. So, I need to move on. Let's think about reinscribing poverty and this notion of the double whammy. This is an adaptation of a figure that I've used elsewhere around a vicious circle, really, which cycles between poor mental health and the experience of poverty. And I guess what we can see here is that if you're experiencing poverty, not just the material deprivation that may go with that, but also stigma and social exclusion, this will have an impact on your mental well-being. And we've seen that in some of the quotes that I've offered. Furthermore, though, if your mental health is poor, in whatever way, this may have a further effect on the stigma and social exclusion that you experience. So we have a vicious circle, or a double whammy, depending on how you want to look at it. And in the middle, because I mentioned earlier on this notion about diversity, those experiences will be further compounded by issues around class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, age, and religion, and so on. So this is what I mean when I talk about a double whammy. I think also, if we think about poverty and well-being, it is interesting to reflect on the notion of embodiment. Nancy Krieger is a professor of social epidemiology at Harvard University in the States. And in her work, she's focused on the social and political determinants of ill health in terms of the way in which economic and social deprivation, hazardous environments, have an impact on people's health. And it's what Michael Marmot, who is also a professor of epidemiology and public health. I'm sure when I came into social work, I didn't think I'd be talking about epidemiology and public health. There you go. Who's very well known for his work on the social determinants of health, talks about this in terms of the causes of poor health. And Krieger particularly talks about the way in which discrimination and stigma contribute to compromise people's health and well-being, and how we literally embody that lived experience in terms of the stress that's caused by social exclusion, prejudice and discrimination and stigma. And in terms of mental health, this is also recognised by the report from the World Health Organization, which actually also links back to Michael Marmot's work, and the way in which, over the life course, low-level stress, the kind that we've been talking about, gets under the skin and impacts on people's physiological situation, on their immune and cardiovascular systems, their respiratory systems, that the impact of stress is actually effectively written on the body. So we can see not only will issues around poverty have an impact on mental well-being, they may well have an impact on people's physical health, and then the two interact further. So what we're talking about really is causes and consequences. We recognise that a disproportionate burden of the benefit changes and austerity measures is falling on people with health and disability issues. There is also the experience of sanctions, which many people are finding if they don't, they just miss, in some way, the demand that the job centre is asking of them in order to seek work. And sometimes this might be something as small as missing an appointment, being a little bit late for an appointment, missing an appointment even though they might have told someone that they couldn't attend one week, sanctions. But which means that their benefits are stopped. And this may be for weeks or longer. Again, with very real implications in terms of people's experience of destitution. There's also no real evidence, that I'm aware of, that sanctions work. They're designed to be a punitive approach to get people back into work, to make work pay. But I'm not aware of any evidence that they're effective. There may be some evidence for people cycling in and out of very low-paid and poor working condition type work in order to escape the sanctions. But all they're doing is cycling in and out of poverty. And even perhaps I shouldn't say even, the church groups have got together in terms of looking at the impact of sanctions and have said that they are disturbed that a benefit system intended to provide for the needy and vulnerable is used as a means of coercion and compliance. Now, if I've got anybody in the audience here from the Job Centre, this isn't about a personal criticism of people who are carrying out the work that they are having to do and who are under enormous pressure to meet targets. But it does raise questions for me about the system that we're working in here. We also recognise that cuts in services will have an impact in terms of people using services because of their health, whether that's their physical or mental well-being. We're seeing increasing use of food banks. This is particularly so in Bradford, where recent figures from the Trussell Trust, which organises a number of food banks, say that there's been a massive increase in the food bank parcels that are given out from Bradford. And the Bradford Central Food Bank is now feeding more than double the numbers of people for the second time in a row. And all we're talking about is people getting a fairly meagre basic food parcel for 3 days. And many of the food banks, the Trussell Trust isn't the only organisation that delivers food parcels, but many of them are referral only, so you have already had to perhaps go and talk to a social worker or another agency who are the gatekeepers to going to the food banks, partly in a way to ration demand. And there was an article in the British Medical Journal only last week which referred to the unprecedented increase in food banks, and the highest levels of use occurred where there were the highest rates of sanctioning by the Job Centre, the highest rates of unemployment and cuts in welfare spending. For people who do experience poor mental health, there may also be even greater limitations to the work opportunities that are available to them, and limitations in the kind of support that's available to them as well. And I think it's worth kind of recognising that there's a very low rate of employment if you have mental health difficulties. I think it's perhaps also worth mentioning suicide. I don't know if anybody saw the programme Panorama this week, a very powerful programme about suicide. And whilst the relationship between poor mental health and suicide is complex, I think that if people are driven to suicide, that to me would suggest there are concerns about their mental well-being in the broadest possible sense, that they're absolutely desperate. We do know that the suicide rate is much higher for men than it is for women. Nationally, it's much higher. And it was estimated by a study that was carried out by Barr and colleagues a couple of years ago that the recent recession in the UK has led to about an extra 1,000 suicides in England, predominantly amongst men. And whilst the study is very cautious about making an association between suicide and economic recession, the evidence does suggest that there is a causal relationship. I think it's interesting that in Bradford, actually, the suicide rate is relatively low compared to other parts of the country, although nationally the rate is highest in the northeast, the northwest and the southwest of England, which again might tell us something about the experiences that people have there. I'm running out of time, so I want to just briefly mention cuts in local government spending, and Bradford particularly has experienced severe cuts in the budget for local government. Council has recently had to make really difficult decisions in terms of cutting 34 million for this year's budget and a further 28 million next year. That's going to have an impact on jobs, it's going to have an impact on services, particularly adult and children's services, and it will also have an impact on the voluntary sector, those very organisations that are delivering food and setting up food banks, who are offering advice and support, and organisations that support women fleeing domestic violence. What is also increasingly recognised is that the burden of these local authority and welfare reforms has fallen disproportionately on the north rather than the south of the country. I don't know how clearly you can see this here, but this is about local government spending per head, and the reduction in spending power on the left-hand side, reduction in spending power. I haven't got a little pointy thing, but you can probably pick out Bradford because it's the red area in the middle of the country, where cuts in the spending power of local government are greater than £200 per head. And on the right-hand side, the loss in financial reform. Again, Bradford's not the only little red area in West Yorkshire and Humber, but again, Bradford is high in terms of the cuts pro rata for working age adults. And you can see just from looking at the overall effect of those images that we're looking at massive regional inequalities. I'm not sure if people are going to go rushing off to Scotland now. There's lots of talk about devolution and greater power going to the regions, but there is certainly something to be said for addressing issues around regional inequalities. I just very quickly, I've got a minute, want to draw attention to a wider issue about the prevalence of mental illness. And this is from Wilkinson and Pickett's work on the spirit level, which some of you may be familiar with. And this highlights the fact that those countries where there are greater levels of inequality have higher levels of poor mental health as manifested in mental illness diagnoses. So on the right-hand side, right at the top, you've got the USA, which has highest levels of income inequality and the highest rates of mental illness. Japan is near the bottom, the UK is pretty near the top. It's a very interesting read, the spirit level, in terms of the massive amount of data that they've brought together to argue about inequality. I'm not going to talk about social. So where do we go from here? Leaving aside the election, what should we be doing in Bradford? I think there's something about building on the work that's already going on and maximising the capacity of agencies to combat poverty and to promote mental well-being, and to strengthen the existing strategies for joined-up working, so that everybody involved knows their part that they're playing and how they can support one another about combating poverty in a whole number of ways. I think it's important, which is certainly outside my remit in terms of social work, but we think about inclusive employment opportunities and decent pay for people of Bradford. It's important to value the contribution of people and communities and not to see people who are in poverty as one-dimensional poor people, but to think about the strengths and resources and contributions that people make. And create and increase opportunities for people to participate in decision-making, both locally and regionally. And I just want to leave you with a few final thoughts about how important it is, I think, that we try and disrupt this dominant discourse about poverty. The idea that it's about individuals who are somehow feckless, morally bankrupt, and simply are not motivated to be involved in work. And it's their fault. I would personally suggest that we have to kind of disrupt those ideas. I want to just provide a quote around social injustice, which is from the Commission for the Social Determinants of Health, around social injustice is killing people on a large scale. And I think if we think about mental health and well-being, the impact of poor mental health on people's experiences on a day-to-day basis, we can see that people are either having shorter lives or poorer quality lives than they should have. And I think we have to ask questions about equality, fairness and social justice. So thank you.
Detailed, insightful analysis of poverty and some of its consequences, and some shocking data on Bradford. I was particularly shocked by the 1 in 10 infant mortality in some of our communities here. I want to open the session to any questions. So first and then second. We've got half an hour for questions, so plenty of time.
How far do you think the raising of the minimum wage to a living wage and raising it will help?
I'm always a bit cautious about, it's a good question. I'm cautious about feeling I've got the answers. Intuitively, raising the minimum wage has got to be helpful. There's a lot of talk locally about the living wage and how we should be signing up to the living wage. So I think it is important that we look at decent pay and improving levels of pay, both within Bradford and more widely. I think I would also say that we also have to look at issues around inequality and the gap between the rich those at the top, if you like, of the pile in terms of incomes and those at the bottom. But improving incomes and wages and the minimum wage can only be helpful.
Mashood Haq, retired resident of Bradford. Donna has mentioned IM as a factor, and you, half hour into your speech, picked up infant mortality in Bradford, how it is twice that of London. But I was looking at the figure of one of the boroughs of London, which one is it? Where they have actually narrowed it to equal the London average, which is 4.9, and they have sharply come down. But in Bradford, it's a wee little bit coming down. So what do you think is the cause of it? Are we baby murderers in Bradford?
No, that's the last thing I'm suggesting. Absolutely, that's not what I would be saying at all. I think we have to see that it's associated with poverty and the level of deprivation that many people in Bradford experience. And people are working very hard, I know, in Bradford to address issues around supporting families, good maternity care, the work that's going on with the big Born in Bradford study, and if people are familiar with the Born in Bradford study, which is a longitudinal study, is also about looking to how we can improve the life chances of children born in Bradford. And that includes looking at infant mortality rates. So certainly it's not my raising the infant mortality rate is not a reflection on individuals in Bradford who, I'm not suggesting that it's bad people in Bradford. There is something about the environment which is creating difficulties in Bradford.
May I come back? Just for a second. I think you're right that all things are being done. But 10 years ago, the commission that was established identified 10 factors. And what did Bradford do? Hang on to item 7. Poverty was the number one thing that was identified 10 years ago. And today, poverty is still number one. But the reduction in infant mortality has been abysmally low. What can we do? We can at least look at other places where they have actually reduced it dramatically. I hope we would think twice. And you talk about Born in Bradford. Born in Bradford is good for living children. They're not doing anything for dead children. But how can you reduce infant mortality? How can you improve childcare? Excellent project. So is Every Baby Matters. Excellent project on their own. But not to reduce the infant mortality. I think we need to change our focus somewhere.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I will draw us back to the purpose of this series is for us to engage with the election. And the questions that you're asking really aren't questions for Kate. They're questions for your candidates in your election. And I think Kate's pointed out the narrow political debate that is taking place around poverty, around inequalities that arise from poverty. So what we're trying to do is prompt some more information, more analysis of what we think would be a key issue. And this must be a key issue in whatever constituency you live in Bradford, to be asking the candidates and to try to extend what is, as Kate pointed out, a very narrow debate that we currently suffer.
Haringey was the authority I was thinking of.
Sorry.
Just a couple of quick comments. I mean, I think there's real danger that things are about to get a lot worse. One example will be when universal credit comes in fully, the sanctions regime starts being introduced to people in work. So that's coming. I'm really conscious about stuff like the spirit level was out at the last election, and you got the Tories talking about it. There was bits of it. It's nowhere now. The statistics are the same or worse, but there's no mention of it. I really agree about the politics being within a very narrow. The main parties are not talking about this stuff much at all. And how do we break out of that? And, you know, one of my favourite statistics is the wealth of the richest people in the country has doubled since 2010. And yet we've got a narrative that the country can't afford any of this stuff. You know, how do we break out of that? No answers.
Thank you, Kate. That was really interesting. I've been doing a lot of reading around this recently, mostly about economic inequality, spirit level as well. But I thought it'd be instructive to read a book that was written in 1926, which is about it's the treatment of the poor in the 18th century. And I probably picked that day because my dad would have been 4 in that year. The general strike came, his parents couldn't afford to keep him, and he never went back home. And this dominant discourse, the sort of deserving and the undeserving, is threaded throughout that book. And yet we've got the same thing now, we're just saying shirkers and workers. So in my little way, every conversation I have, I try to disrupt that discourse. But the elephant in the room is massive inequality. We're the 6th richest country in the world, we can afford this. And yet, it's like cognitive capture. All the politicians, they're just talking as if they're all adopting the same agenda. And I don't know what the answer is, I just feel very passionate that we need to change this, it's not right.
I think obviously because of the cultural, the dominant thing is kind of the blame culture on poverty, and people hard-working people get a lot of their self-esteem from thinking that they're doing a lot better than people who are scrounging and stuff, and their self-esteem, they're doing horrible jobs and they're coming out and moaning about people on benefits and stuff, and that's propping them up. So I don't think the culture of this country and the media and everything, I mean, poverty's hard enough, but it's kind of ground in by social attitudes that makes it even worse, maybe.
Maybe we have to be optimistic about change. And there are examples, aren't there, of people challenging.
Thank you, Kate. That was a really interesting lecture. I'm going to put my cards on the table. I'm the Green Party candidate in Bradford West. And I would say that there is a feeling of change within politics, however it's not yet mainstream. And I would hope that in this election, which is going to be an interesting one on all sorts of levels, there is an opportunity for the Greens to come forward with some of their messages around exactly what you've put in your last line, equality, fairness and social justice. And as a candidate, it is very hard to get these things talked about. In all my opening statements, I've talked about the fact that we're the 6th richest nation and we can afford these things. And yet when the questions come from the floor, we're never given the opportunity to say there are different ways of doing things. And I have banged on about this on Twitter and other places. But I do feel that if the electorate really wants this change to happen, there are opportunities to engage with political parties who are out there and who are trying to get these kind of things onto the agenda. But it is very difficult when we have personality politics, particularly in certain constituencies in Bradford. So if people want to come to us things and put questions about these really important issues, I mean, you know, social injustice is killing people on a grand scale. What could be more important? You know, if we could have this dialogue in a sensible and rational forum, it would be marvellous. And I think, I mean, I'm not gunning for votes, but I'm gunning for the debate to be raised because I think it's very important, and it's particularly important in Bradford.
Any other comments or questions? We'll start there because otherwise she's gone back and forth. It's like free gym membership.
I thought, Kate, your bit about the discourse was really enlightening. I attend a monthly forum in the public sector around welfare reform, and I think less than 12 months ago we had a presentation from someone from DWP who isn't locally, I think somebody nationally, and it was actually about the whole idea of work coaches, and of course people in DWP are work coaches, whatever that meant. And this person, who's quite senior, started off the presentation by comparing how this would stop people watching Jeremy Kyle. And I think I was actually quite shocked because I've never seen a public servant actually issue what seemed to be a government view almost. And it was like, I think that in itself was quite a shock for me.
I really enjoyed that presentation. Thank you very much, Kate. I just want to comment on the comment that you made. I think one of the heartening things about going to the Bradford hustings is that whilst there is a lot of personality politics, and I think that's what's really been picked up in the media, one of the heartening things that I found was actually people do want to engage with real issues in Bradford, and I think the question of poverty, of education in Bradford, you know how our schools in Bradford are so good at being poor, it's raised again and again, and I think people are genuinely want to engage in these really important questions. My question really would be, sorry, that was just a comment on a comment. My question goes back to a freedom of information data last year revealed that in the 1980s, the Thatcher government were really thinking about allowing certain cities in the north to go into spirals of decline, and I'm thinking really here about Liverpool. And I wonder to what extent you think political parties or the parties in power, really have a stake in places like Bradford, which are seen as places which don't really contribute to the public purse.
That's a good question. I think it depends on your analysis, doesn't it, really? Because there are different schools of thought. There are people who'd say, well, just poverty is an unfortunate byproduct of the world that we live in. And, I mean, I didn't talk about kind of global issues in relation to this, but I think we need to put poverty in this country and the austerity regimes within that bigger global context as well. And equally, there would be a school of thought which says, yes, some areas of the country, some groups of people are effectively, can be discarded. And this is not an unfortunate byproduct, it's actually the reality of the way in which the economy works, the way in which capitalism, if you like, works. Although having said that, one thing that I didn't say, well, I think it's quite interesting that organisations such as the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the IMF have also raised kind of warning signs about the levels of inequality in this country. So, I don't know. The answer is I don't know.
Can I just comment on that? Take advantage of my chair's position. I recently read a government document just produced 2 months ago called The Northern Powerhouse. There's been a lot on TV about the Northern Powerhouse centred around Manchester and new infrastructural developments. And I read it expecting to read about Bradford. And Bradford wasn't mentioned at all. Many cities in the north were mentioned. Bradford got not one mention in that document. I was very concerned about that, even though I live in Bradford. So I think that's perhaps evidence of what you're talking about there, Barbie, the neglect of areas like that.
Thanks, Kate, for that lecture, and how well you managed to remain fair and I guess optimistic. But well, there's a but there. Because one of the things that struck me when we're looking at the evidence is what's been called in the US the new Jim Crow laws, and increasingly understanding that for particularly young black men that there's a system by which they are stigmatised and criminalised, but from school into prisons very, very quickly. And that's also seen as a problem within the black community, in that it's a class issue. So an awful lot of the discourse within the black community there is around, again, sort of people who do something, work, participate. One of the upshots of that is increased activist conversations about conspiracy. And I think one of the flips to this is that it's dependent awfully on a very rational approach to participation in politics. Have you got any thoughts on any of the possibilities, the speculation by activists in the US that this is some kind of conspiracy that maintains people in certain positions and perhaps maintains the idea of barbarians at the gates that we need to defend against as well?
I'm not sure.
Sorry.
I think I'm not sure. I mean, I'm always a little concerned about any kind of conspiracy theory. And it's interesting that in preparing this session, and it's not quite a response to your question, this notion that austerity isn't just about dealing with the deficit, but is actually about reducing the state. And I've been saying, well, it's an ideological attack on the state. But actually, it's been said very openly. David Cameron has made very clear reference. So, in a sense, things like that are not a conspiracy. It's clear. But I think in response to your particular question, the answer is I don't know. But as I say, I'm always a bit cautious about conspiracy theories, but who knows?
Any questions?
Sorry to have another go, but it was also about, I think, I don't know what you think about this, but part of it's not about diminishing, well, not just about diminishing the role of the state, but providing opportunities for private enterprise to make a profit out of what was once done by the state. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's what's happening. I think the TTIP treaty, which is about kind of open competition, is absolutely central to that. And the idea that, we don't need public services to be delivered by the state, whether that's nationally or locally, but that we can put these out to private enterprise who will be the most efficient, from this, I'm not saying that's right, but, who will deliver this is something that we see more and more of. And certainly if you talk about the NHS as well, that's a very real concern. So I think there is a lot of evidence for that.
John Anderson, I'm a bit dispirited by the pessimism. I'm not prepared not to do things about this. First of all, you can read Owen Jones' The Establishment. If you haven't read Owen Jones' The Establishment, you need to read it. Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, The Shock Doctrine, there's plenty of things in there. And through our churches, I'm a church person, our mosques, our parties, we need to vote, we need to get out there, we need to write, we need to act. There's no time for pessimism and saying we can't do anything. We can do a great deal. And inequality must be reduced. Otherwise, everybody will suffer. As Pickett and Wilkinson say, the rich and the poor, we all suffer.
Thank you for the suggestions of the reading. And I think it's very, just to pick up on the point about Naomi Klein and the climate change issue. I came to the first lecture in this series, I don't know if anybody else, I'm sure other people were here, talking about the Middle East. And what I think was a very significant statement at the end of that lecture was in relation to actually this is all tied up as well with access to resources and climate change. And I think that's something that we have to be mindful of as well, that if we're looking towards strengthening and making societies sustainable, we need to actually bear in mind issues around climate change, as well as everything else, as if we haven't got enough to think about.
Just very quickly, just to echo the last speaker, I think I'm not from Bradford originally, I've been here 40 odd years. I think Bradford's a very magical place, and I was reminded of that on my way home last night, listening to the PM programme, talking about the mosque that had helped the synagogue. And I actually thought, where else in this country, where else in the world would you get something like that happening? You wouldn't. And I think that says something about Bradford and the people in it. And
I think this message about not becoming peasant, if we just sit and look at our boots and say how awful it all is, then nothing will ever change. And I think we have to be optimistic. And I think my sort of starting comment about, I wasn't trying to paint a negative picture of Bradford in a blaming and critical fashion, but to look at some of the challenges. And I think the challenges are embedded structurally, if you like, in terms of the way in which political structures operate, and that's both nationally and internationally. And I think we have, we've got a big challenge on our hands, but we have to be optimistic. And there are people out there who are writing and acting and taking action to make changes.
I want to be an optimist. And I think we all need to be optimistic. There's a lot in stake. But I'm glad that this infant mortality is not sexy to talk about. But you have raised the stake. You have identified that infant mortality matters. And we must do something. So Donna and us all, we must raise the profile of infant mortality in Bradford. If Haringey can do it, so can we. Let's do it together. And let's raise it.
Any other points?
I'm Ethna Dodwell. I'm a retired teacher, but I taught for a long time in primary schools locally. I'm a bit prone to conspiracy theories, and then to telling myself not to be so stupid. And I've always thought there was a conspiracy theory to keep the poor right down there. But what I don't understand is if the conspiracy is between the politicians and big business, which I always think it is, the politicians must be more interested in supporting business than in reducing the state. Because if everybody were paid a living wage, the amount of benefits being paid would drop. They would plummet. And the poor spend more of their money on things in shops. And it just doesn't make sense. And I just think I must be incredibly naive politically. But I can't believe that there isn't work looking around the streets of Bradford, that there isn't work for people to do, and that the Tories really do want to reduce the state, because they're not acting like they do.
Well, we were optimistic a few minutes ago.
No, I just said they're not trying to reduce the state. That should be good news.
I think I might have sort of introduced pessimism, and what I was talking about was I was pessimistic about breaking political parties talking about this stuff right now. And I think what we have to do is talk about redistribution and tackling inequality, and actually I'm an optimist, so just wanted to...
And I think we have to, when you talk about what I've been talking about, a vicious circle, I think we have to look at it systemically, if you like, and think, how can we chip away at this? We're not going to be, well, I mean, we may not think we can change everything overnight, but we can intervene in various ways, and I would say that's true, for example, as a way of addressing infant mortality. Can't just go out and do it overnight, but there will be various ways in which that can be addressed that together will make a difference. And I think that's really important.
Can I just ask another question, which is completely different? On your scatter diagram, Italy seems to be an odd one out, because they have got low mental problem and high wage. What can you hazard a guess why Italy is so? That their mental illness is lower than America or England, and still their earnings is comparable.
I would only be speculating, and any one of us, I mean, people may have ideas about that. It would be worth looking at issues around culture, around social capital, notions of community that might support people in adversity, despite the inequalities.
Sunshine and good food as well, I think.
Well, yes.
It's a good lecture, and I really enjoyed it. Can I ask simply this? Do you think taking a job locally is better than not having a job, even if it's a poor paid job, low skill, my job, whatever you want to call it. In terms of trying to deal with poverty, do people have a right to not take a job if there's a job on offer?
I think that gets us into issues, for example, around zero-hours contracts, where people in theory may have a job, but the work is unpredictable, the income is very variable, and I can quite understand that people may make rational decisions that that would not be a sensible way to proceed, and similarly but are kinds of precarious, low-paid employment. Equally, for some people, I think people have to make decisions around this individually, but of course that people don't have the option at the moment in terms of the way the job centres work. That sometimes a job may be a way forward for them. And I think it's interesting to think about work in relation to mental health, because there was a lot of evidence that good work experiences for people with mental health difficulties can improve people's mental health and well-being. But equally, that's not, I wouldn't argue for that as a job at any cost, because the experience of poor working conditions, low pay, and the sort of stress of difficulties at work will actually have a significant impact on any of our well-being.
Do you think that's a good enough argument for somebody to turn down a job offer in today's narrative?
I think the question is the risk analysis that people have to make around the job centre, and it's not for me to say that.
Well, I'm asking, because this was a tremendous lecture, but do you think maybe the state's too inflexible when it comes to allowing people to move in and out of employment, or gain employment, at risk of losing all the benefits, which I think is in the back of a lot of people's minds, and then maybe 3 months later, or can't cope, or through various issues they can't get involved in the 9 to 5, they're then required to go back on this, into the system, shall we say, to a certain degree.
I think
the state's not reactive enough.
The dice are loaded against people making decisions in that situation.
Okay. There's one other thing I'd just like to mention. I came here 20 years ago, I did a degree here, never left Bradford. It was a peace studies degree. But I've watched Bradford politicians lose out to Leeds in the last 20 years. You need to walk into two cities, and they're two very different cities now. So for the last 20 years, Bradford needs to take some responsibility of the failures of the poverty in here, in this city. You go to Ilkley, it's almost too good to be true, but living in the middle of Bradford, the politicians need to be pulled up a little bit more.
Thank you. Can we politicians got a would-be politician.
I'd just point out that the centre of Leeds may be full of financial sector wealth, but actually if you're in the council estate on the outskirts of Leeds, you're pretty much in the same position as somebody in the 10%
I understand the Deprivation, but I do think the physical reality is there for all to see. I don't disagree that Bell Hour's a mess as well. I don't disagree at all.
Politically, Bradford has made some catastrophic decisions in the past 20 years. I'll put my hand up and say that, I've been part of it, but, we've all watched it happen.
Why?
Why? Well, we could all of us in this room could say we've shouldered some responsibility for what's happening. But I do find it hard when Leeds is always trumpeted as this amazing place, and yet they've let parts of their population
comparing it to
left behind in the same.
Okay, thanks. Anybody got any further questions now?
Not a question, it's a response for this man over here.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I think there's some fairly recent Australian research that's found that poor employment is worse for your mental health than being unemployed, and that's a number of measures, including low pay, insecurity, high stress, conflict, and those kinds of demands. So actually, if we were to follow the evidence, or the emerging evidence, bearing in mind it's the other side of the world, it would seem to suggest that it isn't good for people to just take any job that they're offered, and that there's some caveats with that. However, good employment does seem to be good for people's mental and physical well-being. So I think that's where the trend seems to be heading.
Okay. Thank you. There don't seem to be any further points. I want to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank you for coming and engaging in what we think here at the University of Bradford and in the Faculty of Social Sciences, which I'm Dean of. I'm very proud to be Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences here. Our project here is to raise awareness, to raise the debate, to this kind of level. It's unfortunate that sometimes we don't get this kind of level of debate in the hustings and in the press. And we do have a narrow political debate, and this is what this is about. So I think in many ways we're preaching to the converted a little bit, but I want to thank you for engaging in this process and supporting the University of Bradford in this important exercise. We do have some hustings tomorrow night, but unfortunately there are no tickets left. I want to particularly thank Kate for taking time out of her heavy workload to provide us with a really detailed understanding of poverty, how we might think about poverty, how we might rethink about poverty, to give us some very shocking details and shocking data, very hard data, hard-hitting data for us to digest, data on poverty, data on the consequences, the inequalities that follow from poverty. And we've been optimistic and pessimistic in various questions that we've asked and comments that we've had. But what we have done is we've engaged with this debate. And I'm really happy that we've engaged with that debate, and we're going out of this room, because of Kate's lecture, far more informed about some of the issues that we need to be asking our politicians and our candidates about as we race towards May 8th. So I'd like to really thank Kate for what was a fabulous, fabulous lecture. Thank you, Kate. There we have Jim Goddard, who is going to be talking on the 23rd of April about what do the social policy proposals of the three main political parties mean. Our Green candidate might be upset about that. And then on the 30th of April, Parveen is going to be talking about British Muslim politics. So if you haven't already registered for those events, we would very much hope that you do so, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.